Gasped to learn that nearly 150 years later, scientists plan to add lead to fuel. Doctors and public health officials from MIT, Harvard, Yale, and the US Health Service wrote to Midgley and warned them against producing tetraethyl lead. They called lead a creeping and malicious poison and a serious menace to public health. Their concerns were dismissed.
This model shows how just the right amount of fluid containing tetraethyl lead and dye is added to the gasoline.
No one doubted that a lot of lead was bad for you, but how much harm could a little lead do?
Do you like Zillikami?
By the 1950s, millions of motorists globally were burning lead in their cars and releasing it into the air. Some of that lead ended up on Claire Patterson's zircon samples, preventing him from determining their age. In 1952, he moved to Caltech, where he built a new lab from scratch. Suspicious of environmental contamination, he tore the electrical cables out of the walls to remove the lead solder. He cleaned the floors and benches daily with ammonia and made sure that air was always being blown out of the lab. To go inside, you had to wear a plastic bunny suit. Patterson basically invented the clean room. Inside that room, he turned his attention to the oldest rocks in the solar system, meteorites. All the original rocks on Earth had long since been destroyed by tectonic activity. But meteorites come from asteroids, which formed around the same time as Earth. They have just been drifting through space until they entered the Earth's atmosphere. So the best way to measure the age of the Earth was to measure the age of meteorites. Patterson measured 5 meteorites, each with 3 different radiometric dating techniques, and he found they were all 4.55 billion years old. That number is within 0.15% of the currently accepted value for the age of the Earth. You know, before Patterson's experiment, people thought the Earth was a billion years younger. So Patterson had done it. He measured the age of the Earth. But he wasn't done getting rid of lead contaminants. Public concern about lead exposure had continued to grow. But President of Standard Oil, Frank Howard, pushed back, saying, "We do not feel justified in giving up what has come to the industry like a gift from heaven on the possibility that a hazard may be involved in it." But Patterson wondered, just how natural is the lead in our environment? And he had just the skills to find out.
He started eating dirt for 5 years and then measured his own blood.
He began by measuring lead in the oceans.
If it
were natural, he expected the concentration of lead to be the same regardless of depth. But if lead pollution had increased recently, it would be more concentrated near the surface. He took samples in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans down to a depth of 4 kilometers. And sure enough, lead concentrations were nearly 10 times higher near the surface. Lead pollution was clearly recent, but when exactly had it occurred? To find out, Patterson had to go to Greenland and Antarctica. Ice cores record the level of lead in the air going back thousands of years. The levels of lead in the atmosphere have been elevated for the last 4,500 years. All of it is due to human activity, mainly smelting ores to make metal. And for comparison, he measured the lead in bones and teeth of Peruvian and Egyptian mummies. Since they lived over 1,600 years ago, they would have been exposed to much less lead in their lifetimes. He expected to find modern Americans had about 100 times as much lead in their bones, but results showed it was closer to a factor of 1,000. 20th century Americans had 1,000 times more lead in their bones than their ancestors. Studies of baby teeth revealed that even lead exposure well below the level considered safe resulted in delayed learning, decreased IQ, and increased behavioral problems.
And there is a broad consensus on the part of everybody except the lead industry and its
That's pretty wild.
Lead is extremely toxic at extremely low doses.
A follow-up study showed that those with higher levels of lead in their baby teeth were many times more likely to fail out of high school. As a result of studies like these, the CDC's guidelines for the acceptable level of lead in children's blood dropped from 60 micrograms per deciliter down to 3.5. And as far as we know today, there is no safe level of lead. Globally, lead is believed to be responsible for nearly 2/3 of all unexplained intellectual disability.
Holy shit.
Lead caused a loss of more than 800 million IQ points.
Oh, that's a
The
weird
world
statistic.
is less intelligent today because of leaded gasoline.
That's
But
fucking
there
crazy.
are even more troubling correlations. The US saw a steady rise in crime from the 1970s to the 1990s. Then it abruptly declined. This graph looks eerily similar to a plot of preschool blood lead levels, just offset by 20 years. The obvious question is, did kids who were exposed to higher levels of lead grow up to commit more crimes than they otherwise would have? You might think this is just a spurious correlation, but the same pattern appears in many countries, including Britain, Canada, and Australia. And we know there's a causal connection between lead exposure and antisocial or violent behavior. A study of 340 teenagers
damn.
found that those who were arrested were 4 times as likely to have elevated lead in their bones than similar demographic controls
What
who
leads
didn't
to the
have
higher...
run-ins with the law.
I'm sure this will be answered,
Now,
but
this doesn't mean
I
that
guess, well, maybe it won't be since it's almost over. What leads to the higher levels of lead concentration in the infants and like the newborns and all of that? Is it just like how close they are to the gasoline or what? The water, I guess, lead paint. Yeah, lead's present in pretty much all food that's grown in the ground, but I feel like that's not going to be a huge contributing factor for like a newborn. A newborn's not going to be eating a ton of apples, right? But yeah, lead is literally in everything that grows from the soil. Tap water. Is there lead in the tap water? Yeah, I guess I didn't think of lead pipes. So like in older houses and shit.
lead is responsible for all of the increase in crime, but it's very likely responsible for some of it. Now, it's tough to estimate the precise death toll of lead. One of its lesser-known effects is a hardening of the arteries, leading to increased cardiovascular disease. Rate over the past century, that amounts to 25 million deaths in the US alone. Globally, the figure may approach 100 million. Most of those deaths are due to Midgley's decision to put lead in gasoline, a substance he knew firsthand was toxic, but he did it anyway to maximize profits. And the problem is not over.
Gas.
Current estimates of deaths caused by lead range from 500 to 900,000 per year. That's over 800 million children have blood lead levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter. A lot of this lead now comes from batteries and industrial processes, but some is still due to Midgley's invention. Now, after Midgley's success with ethyl, he was put in charge of another engineering project. GM wasn't just making cars, but also household appliances. And fridges had a problem. The two most common gases used as refrigerants were methylformate and sulfur dioxide. One is highly toxic, the other is flammable. Midgley was tasked with creating a safer alternative, and in 1928 he developed a non-toxic and non-flammable refrigerant, dichloro-difluoromethane. GM called this new product Freon, and to demonstrate Freon's safety, during the unveiling at the American Chemical Society, Midgley inhaled a lungful of this gas and blew out a candle. In the following decades, CFCs like Freon became very popular.
Midgley's a lot of things, but a coward he is not.
The problem is CFCs are light and stable. When released into the atmosphere, they climb up into the stratosphere, where they can remain for 50 to 100 years.
Did you know that?
But if a CFC molecule is hit by an ultraviolet photon of just the right energy, it breaks apart, releasing a chlorine atom. And this chlorine atom can then react with ozone, breaking it apart into chlorine monoxide and oxygen gas. The result was another environmental disaster, the hole in the ozone layer. With less ozone, more UV light penetrates the atmosphere, increasing the rates of skin cancer and cataracts. Plus, CFCs are potent greenhouse gases. Per kilogram, they produce 10,000 times more warming than CO2. The historian John McNeill wrote that Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history.
So this guy was an actual
supervillain. To phase out CFCs, the Montreal Protocol went into effect in 1989. And the ozone...
he might still be alive, being kept alive by lead and chlorofluorocarbons. Let's see. Oh, this is his wife. I was going to say, he died in 2018. Fucking good run. He died in 1944. Damn, she had a real good run.
In 1940, at the age of 51, Midgley contracted polio and became physically disabled. So to help him get up, he devised a mechanical bed controlled by a series of ropes and pulleys. On November 2nd, 1944, while using the contraption, he became tangled in the ropes and died of
Oh my
strangulation.
god. Holy
Thanks to the
shit.
work of Claire Patterson,
What
it
a
became clear
conclusion.
that the lead in our environment is not natural. Burning lead in combustion engines spread the toxic element across the planet, into the air, oceans, the snow at the South Pole, and even our bones. Japan was the first to ban leaded fuel in cars in 1986, but other countries soon followed suit. Algeria was the last to do so in 2021. The UN calculates that
not
the
bad.
elimination of lead from gas saves over 1 million lives per year and $2.45 trillion. But leaded gas is still used, by the way, in piston-driven airplane engines.
Yep, I knew
That's
that.
now the largest source of lead emissions into the air in the US. You will observe with concern how long a useful truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced on.
Damn, that music,
That was good.
that got intense at the end there.